The day my HOA president climbed onto my roof and ripped down what she called my ugly antenna was the same day the black SUVs rolled into our neighborhood, and everything she thought she knew about rules completely fell apart. I'm not exaggerating when I say the look on her face changed from confident to terrified in about 30 seconds. Because that antenna she hated so much wasn't just a random piece of metal. It was part of a licensed radio setup I used for emergency communications. And the people who showed up to ask about it were not from the HOA. They were federal agents. Before we get into the story, if you enjoy crazy HOA drama and real-life Karen stories like this, take a second to like the video and subscribe to Karen Stories Daily. It really helps the channel grow. And if you've ever dealt with someone who thinks neighborhood rules apply to everyone except them, you're going to appreciate how this story turns out. So this whole thing started about a year after I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The place looked like something out of a brochure. Clean streets, trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, kids riding bikes in the afternoon, and neighbors walking their dogs every evening. On the surface, it was peaceful, but like a lot of suburban neighborhoods, it had a homeowners association. Now I didn't hate HOA letters. I understood the basic idea. They're supposed to maintain property values and keep the neighborhood looking nice. I followed the rules. My lawn was always trimmed. My house looked good, and I never caused problems. The only thing about my house that stood out a little was a small antenna mounted near the back corner of my roof. It wasn't huge, maybe 10 feet tall, thin metal, nothing flashy. Most people barely noticed it, but that antenna was important to me. You see, I've been a licensed amateur radio operator for years. Ham radio is something I picked up as a hobby, but it's also incredibly useful during emergencies. When storms knock out cell towers or internet service, ham radio operators are often the only people still able to communicate. In fact, many local emergency management agencies rely on volunteer radio operators during disasters. My antenna allowed me to connect with other operators across the state, and sometimes across the country. And here's the key part of the story. Federal law actually protects amateur radio antennas from being restricted by HOA letters in most cases. At the time, though, I didn't think that detail would ever matter. Until Karen noticed it. I met Karen about 3 weeks after moving in. I was out in my driveway washing my truck when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned around and saw a woman standing at the end of my driveway with a clipboard. Mid-50s. Sunglasses, perfectly styled hair, arms crossed like she was about to give a lecture. She said, "You must be the new homeowner." I nodded and said, "Yeah, just moved in recently." Instead of smiling, she looked up at my roof. Then she pointed. "What is that?" I glanced up and said, "Oh, that's my radio antenna." She frowned immediately. "That's not allowed now." I was a little confused. I asked what she meant. She said, "Exterior structures like that violate HOA guidelines." I explained calmly that it was part of a licensed amateur radio setup, and that federal regulations allow them. Karen gave me that tight smile people use when they've already decided they're right. "Well," she said, "we'll see about that." Then she turned around and walked away. That was my introduction to Karen. Later that evening, my neighbor Dave came over while I was grilling, and I mentioned the strange conversation. Dave laughed and said, "You met the HOA president." Apparently, Karen had been running the HOA for almost 8 years, and according to Dave, she took the rules very seriously. Mailbox colors, lawn height, holiday decorations. If it was visible from the street, Karen had an opinion about it. Still, for the next couple of weeks, nothing happened. Then one morning I opened my mailbox and found a letter from the HOA. It was a violation notice. According to the letter, my unauthorized rooftop structure had to be removed within 7 days or I would begin receiving daily fines. I wasn't surprised, but I also knew the law. So instead of arguing with Karen directly, I sent a polite email to the HOA explaining that the antenna was protected under federal regulations for amateur radio operators. I even included links and documentation. 2 days later, Karen knocked on my door. She looked irritated. "I received your mail," she said. I asked if she had reviewed the information. She replied, "The HOA rules still apply." I explained again that federal law overrides HOA guidelines when it comes to amateur radio antennas. Karen shook her head. "Not in this neighborhood." Then she walked away. At that point, one assumed we would eventually sort it out through paperwork or HOA meetings. But Karen had other plans. About a week later, I came home from work and immediately noticed something was wrong. My roof looked different. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then it hit me. The antenna was gone. I parked the truck and walked closer to the house. The mounting bracket was still there, but the antenna itself had been completely removed. For a second, I thought maybe strong wind had somehow knocked it loose. Then I saw the ladder marks in the grass. Someone had climbed onto my roof. And deep down I already knew exactly who it was. A few minutes later, my neighbor Dave walked over holding something. It was the antenna. Bent. He said, "You're not going to like this." Apparently earlier that afternoon, Karen had shown up with a ladder and one of the HOA board members. Dave watched from his window as they climbed onto my roof and removed the antenna. She told anyone who asked that she was enforcing HOA compliance. I stood there holding the bent metal and honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen hadn't just complained. She had climbed onto my property and removed equipment that didn't belong to her. So I did the obvious thing. I called the police. An officer came out and took a report. When I explained the situation, he raised an eyebrow. "Wait," he said. "She climbed onto your roof." I nodded. Double quotes, "and removed your property." He wrote everything down and said they would speak with her. But that wasn't the end of it. Because that antenna wasn't just for hobby radio chats. I also volunteered with a regional emergency communication network that worked with disaster response groups. Earlier that week, we had been testing equipment for storm season, and that antenna was part of the setup. The next morning, I contacted the regional coordinator for the network and explained what happened. He was not amused. Apparently, the system I used was tied into a federally licensed radio frequency network used during emergency situations. When equipment connected to that system suddenly goes offline, it raises questions. And those questions get reported. 2 days later, something very unusual happened. Around noon, 2 black SUVs pulled slowly into our neighborhood. They parked near my house. Out stepped 2 men in dark jackets. They walked up to my door and introduced themselves. They were federal agents, specifically. They were investigating interference with licensed radio communications equipment. Now imagine Karen standing across the street watching that happen. She had no idea what was going on. The agents asked me a few questions about the antenna and the radio system. Then they asked if anyone had tampered with the equipment. I told them exactly what happened. About 10 minutes later, they walked across the street to Karen's house. The conversation that followed was interesting. From my porch, I could see Karen gesturing wildly while the agent spoke calmly. At one point, she pointed toward my house like she was explaining something. But the agents didn't look impressed. Eventually, they asked to see the antenna. She had removed. Karen actually brought it out. Bent. The agents examined it and took photos. And that's when Karen finally realized she might have made a very serious mistake. Because interfering with licensed communications equipment isn't just a neighborhood dispute. It can be a federal issue. Now, to be clear, nobody got arrested that day. But Karen's attitude changed very quickly. Later that evening, I received a very different kind of email from the HOA. The violation notice had been withdrawn. The message also stated that the HOA would not interfere with my radio equipment again. A week later, I installed a new antenna. This time it was slightly taller. And Karen? She never complained about it. Again, these days my neighbors still laugh about the day Karen tried to enforce HOA rules and ended up explaining herself to federal agents. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen like this, let me know in the comments, because those stories are always wild. And if you enjoyed this one, share it with a friend who loves neighborhood drama, and make sure you're subscribed to Karen Stories Daily for more stories, where the Karen learns the hard way that sometimes the rules she's trying to enforce aren't actually the ones that matter.